Hello, and welcome to this last session of the review series, Training in Preparation for the NAPLI examination. You must be very pleased that this is the last one, and for this last review session we're going to be dealing with foreign animal diseases. These are obviously the diseases we hope that many of you will never see. And on this first slide you can see that there are altogether here 6 diseases that I'm going to be discussing today. We're going to be dealing with the foot and mouth epidemic in the United Kingdom, and then we'll mention bovine spongiform encephalopathy. In other words, this is mad cow disease, and how this relates to the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a human disease. Then we're actually going to talk a little bit about West Nile virus infections. And of course immediately you'll say, well, this isn't a foreign animal disease. Well, of course it's not. But it was until 1999 when we first recognized it in the United States. And I think this draws an important point immediately, and that is that a foreign animal disease is defined by virtue of the perspective of what country you live in. And obviously that changes depending upon whether you're in Africa, Australia, or wherever. And after we've dealt with West Nile, we're going to move on to African horse sickness, explain how this is a very important disease, a disease that we fear we could get here in the United States, and then progress to African swine fever, which was once in the Caribbean, and finish up with Rift Valley fever and rinderpest. Now, the diseases that normally we consider to be foreign animal diseases, at least from the perspective of here in the United States, are those that are characterized by being very transmissible, and they have the potential for very serious and rapid spread, and irrespective of national borders. And of course they have serious socio-economic or public health consequences, and they become very important, therefore, in the international trade and also of animal products. Now, while we are going to discuss foot and mouth disease in detail, remember there are other diseases that need to be differentiated from it, such as swine vesicular disease, vesicular stomatitis, and one not mentioned here, vesicular exanthema. There are also on list A diseases, those of African horse sickness, which is an insect-transmitted disease, transmitted in fact by culicoides, and that's very similar to a disease that we see here in terms of its epidemiology here in the United States, and that's the disease of blue tongue. And we see blue tongue here in Florida on a fairly regular basis if we have imported sheep. African swine fever is also transmitted by an arthropod, in this case it's the soft tick, and Rift Valley fever, a disease that is transmitted by the mosquito. Rinderpest is a disease that is now, as we will discuss, restricted in large part to Pakistan and East Africa. And as I said before, we're going to talk a little bit about West Nile and BSE. And note in this case that neither BSE nor West Nile are actually on the list A diseases. The argument is, particularly with BSE, that this is not a rapidly spreading disease, and in the case of West Nile, I think this is a disease that might well be added to the list A in due course. Now, as we move forward discussing foreign animal diseases, we have to recognize that many of them can also be determined as emerging diseases. Emerging diseases, it's a terminology that was introduced some years ago by the Centers for Disease Control. Simply means that these are diseases that seem to be increasing in their prevalence around the world, or are geographically spreading quite rapidly. Now, other terms that you might meet when studying foreign animal diseases are the terms exotic versus foreign. Exotic simply means that this is a disease that does not normally exist within the country of concern. And we've already mentioned that many of these diseases are capable of crossing national borders, and you will see the term transboundary to describe that capability of these diseases. Species jumpers, as the name implies, are diseases that have the capability of going from one species of animal to another. And while we don't necessarily consider influenza virus a foreign animal disease, this is the classic example of a species jumping virus. Now, molecular epidemiology simply means that by studying the virus in great detail, we can determine its origin, and we'll give you some examples of that as we work through. The other term that I'm sure you're aware of by now is that of arboviruses, and arbo in this context stands for arthropod-borne. Pandemic, you know epidemic, you know endemic, and pandemic simply means that this is an epidemic in effect that is usually of worldwide importance. And finally, we have to recognize that evolution is occurring in all of these viruses and determining their ability to spread in some cases, and we call this genetic shift and drift. Shift is when there is a major change in a virus, and drift when we get minor change to its antigenic composition. This is a rather complicated diagram, but it's one that you might like to come back to when you look at these slides on the web. And it simply outlines to you that there are many factors that contribute towards the way in which a virus can be transmitted from one country to another. And it also gives you some idea of the interactions between not only human disease, but also interactions between wildlife and domestic animals and the components that fit into this. For example, if we were talking about West Nile, we would have to recognize that global travel contributes significantly perhaps to the introduction of this virus into the United States in the first place. But let's now start with foot and mouth disease and talk about this disease as it impacted the United Kingdom last year. Well, the first thing to determine is that it's a picornavirus, and it's a disease that is characterized by vesicles. Now, the good news is that through a very draconian, and that obviously means a very intensive and extensive control policy, it is possible to, in fact, recognize now the United Kingdom as free of disease since January the 22nd of this year. And that declaration was by the Office International des Épidémies, in other words, that organization that makes the list A diseases. Well, how extensive and how rapidly did this epidemic spread within the United Kingdom? Well, the disease first started down here, was first recognized, let's be more accurate, in an area called Essex, but truly, while it was recognized in an abattoir here, the origin of the disease was up here in Northumberland. And subsequently, by April the 11th, and the epidemic started on February the 20th, it had spread to many different parts of the country. Then disease control programs were very much in place, and you can see that large areas of the country, because of these disease control programs, remained free of disease. However, during that time, the disease had also spread to the continent, particularly to the Netherlands, and this was associated with the movement of infected cattle. And there were also cases in France, and there was one case in Eire. All told, there were some 2,030 outbreaks of this disease in Britain. Now, an outbreak in this context, it largely means an outbreak on a farm. And you can imagine the misery that's associated with disease existing on these farms, because the policy is to slaughter out all animals on infected farms. And you can see here that the epidemic reached its peak very quickly after its initial recognition in February. And you can see that really by the end of March, there were some 50 outbreaks a day occurring in Britain. And this then tailed off as control measures got in place, so that by the end of September, the last case was recognized. Let's talk a little bit now about what foot and mouth disease is. First of all, remember that it has a short incubation period, commonly 4 to 5 days, but between 2 and 14 days. It is very infectious, and it's caused by the coronavirus, a computerized version of which you see here on the right, and it's transmitted between countries in meat products. Human infection is very uncommon. It does occur, but it's very uncommon. In this last epidemic, for example, there were no cases, no human cases of foot and mouth disease. There is, however, a disease that is recognized particularly in children that is called hand, foot and mouth disease. And this is caused by an unrelated virus, but as veterinarians in practice, you may commonly be asked, what is hand, foot and mouth disease? It's actually caused by a virus called the Coxsackie virus. And we must always remember that foot and mouth disease could reoccur in the United States. And I say reoccur because this disease occurred during the early part of the 20th century, and the last case was in California in 1929. How do we recognize foot and mouth disease? Well, it is a disease that is characterized by what people commonly call blisters, more accurately called vesicles. And you can see in this center photograph here a ruptured vesicle on the tongue of a steer. To the left here you can see an interdigital vesicle that is unruptured. And the disease in cattle is quite easily recognized, although you have to differentiate it from vesicular stomatitis here in the United States, although vesicular stomatitis occurs only infrequently in the US. In pigs, there may be lesions on the tongue, as you can see here, but more commonly you're going to see extensive vesication involving the feet, and in some cases the entire horn will be shed from the foot, obviously making the affected pigs very lame indeed. In sheep, the disease is, in all honesty, very difficult to recognize and diagnose. In this particular case, you've got a fairly classical ruptured vesicle on the dental pad, but commonly mouth lesions are infrequent, and the foot lesions themselves are minor, but can in fact be to a certain extent confused with conditions such as foot rot. But using one's nose, one can differentiate the two to a certain extent. Obviously foot rot has an offensive odor, whereas foot and mouth disease does not. So if we now summarize very quickly the situation regarding the epidemiology of foot and mouth disease, we can categorize pigs as amplifiers, and I'll come back to that in a short while, cattle as indicators, and sheep as silent spreaders. We can recognize that foot and mouth disease also stands for, or at least the letters stand for, fast-moving disease, and that's very important to remember. And we also can recognize that transmission is by aerosol once fomite and animal movement is controlled. And fomite in this context is obviously contaminated equipment, such as a veterinarian may take from farm to farm. Ruminants can in fact become carriers of this virus, and the virus is present within the pharynx of these animals, and it can be present there for up to a year in cattle. I've already said that it has a very short incubation period, and the other feature that's of importance relative to controlling this disease is that the virus is excreted quite often by an animal before clinical lesions are seen, and we call that prodromal virus excretion. Now, the virus titer in 1 ml of vesicular fluid might be as high as 10 to the 7 tissue culture infectious doses per ml. In other words, that's 10 million infectious particles. When we consider that the aerosol infective dose for cattle is about 10 tissue culture infectious doses, you can see how easily this virus is transmitted. However, it is a relatively fragile virus, and it's stable for days rather than months in the environment. But we also have to recognize that foot-and-mouth disease affects many different species, and wildlife can also become infected. So how does it spread? Well, we've already mentioned that it spreads on fomites, and it also spreads as an aerosol. And we can break down these routes of transmission into controllable, obviously through contact with infected foodstuffs or other things that are being contaminated by infected animals. And in this context, we have to recognize, as you see here, that disinfection is extremely important. But the policeman standing here also illustrates to us that, in fact, the legal system under which foot-and-mouth disease is controlled is also very important. So there is a myriad different legal powers that can be exercised in the control of foot-and-mouth disease. Clearly, in terms of the controllable spread, we have to recognize that the virus is present in nearly all excretions from an animal: saliva, milk, and dung of infected animals. And really, any person who has attended diseased animals, if they are not thoroughly disinfected in terms of their clothing and their boots, they also can transmit disease. You will also hear that the virus can be found in the nose of people who have been looking at animals, but this virus normally is present in reasonably low titer, and it's also present for about 24 hours. Clearly, and we often see this illustrated on television, the tires of vehicles are usually disinfected to prevent the spread of this disease. However, when it comes to the not controllable components, clearly aerosols are produced, and these are very difficult to control. If I can just comment on the aerosol transmission, pigs produce more virus than the other species, and that is why they are considered to be the amplifiers of disease. Well, when an outbreak is recognized on a farm, it goes through a series of, or the farm itself goes through a series of procedures. First of all, we've just mentioned that there's notification, quarantine, and diagnosis on the farm at the very beginning when foot-and-mouth disease is suspected. At that point, movement control is enforced around the farm, and in some cases, such as in Britain, it was recognized there were so many individual outbreaks occurring that movement control was in fact over the entire country. On the individual farm, the animals are appraised for their value, they are then slaughtered and disposed of, and then the farm itself is disinfected, and some months later restocking is allowed, and usually sentinel animals, in other words, animals to see if there is existing infection somewhere on the farm. Sentinel animals are usually put on first of all. Well, using that policy, the epidemic in the United Kingdom resulted in the slaughter altogether of nearly 4 million animals, because not only were animals slaughtered on the farm itself, but they were also slaughtered on contiguous farms. In other words, those farms that bordered those affected farms, even though the contiguous farms did not show evidence of infection. And this culling policy was draconian, as I said earlier on, and it was really a scorched earth policy to prevent this disease spreading rapidly. As I said, contiguous premises, and we're looking now at some 7,500 premises, were also slaughtered out, and you can begin to see the extent of the impact of this on society in Britain. Well, where did this virus come from? And what is really the world situation currently? Here in the United States, we have been free of disease since 1929. But that does not speak for other areas of the world, particularly Asia which is where we believe this epidemic originated from, the epidemic that is in the United Kingdom. It is believed that it was imported into the United Kingdom in the form of infected meat. And by using molecular epidemiology, we can recognize that the virus is closely related, in fact, to a virus that was causing disease in South Africa, it's this one here, and also the virus that was causing disease in Japan. But we believe that somewhere such as India might really be the true source of this virus. Interestingly, if we look at the consignments of meat, both illegally intercepted and also being brought in as hand luggage annually into the United Kingdom, you may be amazed that as much as 730 tons is confiscated annually as hand luggage in the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, pigs are still fed with garbage, or swill as it is called in Britain, and it is through this illegal importation of meat in the first place, and subsequently some of that meat being infected, accidentally getting into the food source for pigs being fed with swill or garbage, and that leads to the outbreak starting. And as I said earlier, pigs are amplifiers, and this then leads to infected aerosols of virus blowing downwind from the pig farm to neighboring cattle and sheep. And that's how this epidemic started in the United Kingdom. Now, with the extent of the slaughter policy in the United Kingdom, many people have said, why not use vaccine? Well, vaccines certainly are effective if you know the serotype and the subtype, in other words, the molecular characterization of the virus. But having said that, there are 7 different serotypes of blue tongue. Sorry, why did I say blue tongue there? Of foot and mouth disease present around the world, and we therefore have to develop vaccines against all of those. The vaccines are inactivated, 2 shots are necessary, and they have to be used at 6-monthly intervals thereafter. And it is interesting that vaccinates are still susceptible to infection with foot and mouth disease, even if they do not develop clinical disease. And this is important, therefore, because they may carry virus, and this leads to a country having difficulty in declaring itself free of infection. I also mentioned earlier to you that foot and mouth disease can infect wildlife species. In Britain, there was concern initially that roe deer were infected with foot and mouth disease, as you can see here on the right-hand side. This is a photograph taken of a roe deer with what looks like vesicular lesions on the tongue, taken some few days after clearly the animal had died naturally. And this on the left here is experimental disease. In fact, I did this work myself in Britain when I lived there. And this is experimental foot and mouth disease in roe deer, which definitely shows that they are susceptible. And you also get foot lesions, vesicular lesions following the coronary band, and subsequently you can get separation of the bulbs of the heel. The good news is that foot and mouth disease was not recognized in wildlife in Britain during this last epidemic. Well, what are we doing here in the United States to make sure that we don't get foot and mouth disease? We've always had a policy of rigidly enforcing, first of all, surveillance, and clearly we recognize that with the amount of hand luggage that is brought into countries and the extent of global traffic, that this is always possible. So passenger awareness of the risk that they could unwittingly introduce to the United States has been one of the cornerstones for developing this policy. And obviously many products are prohibited, and we also have embassies overseas gathering information on foreign animal diseases. And clearly we have policies of developing good diagnostic technology to detect these diseases as quickly as possible. And you all know that when you come into airports, if you've been on a farm, that you get your boots disinfected. Here in Florida specifically, we have been educating livestock owners as to the quick recognition of the disease were it to occur, and we have also been working with them to develop what is described as biosecurity on the farm, so that the disease is not introduced to the farming livestock of the United States. So what we really have seen, if we come back to our complex diagram of interactions between agents and domestic animals, wildlife, and humans, we can see that in this particular case we've been really dealing with agricultural intensification. The concentration, particularly of sheep in the United Kingdom, led to the distribution of this virus very rapidly around the country. And also we have to address the whole question of global traffic. Let's now move, in fact, to bovine spongiform encephalopathy, often known as mad cow disease, and its associated disease in young people, and by that I mean people usually in their late teens and early 20s, that is called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which, for convenience, we abbreviate to variant CJD. Now, foot and mouth disease, as we've just discussed, is a disease that has now been eradicated from the United Kingdom. But once again, we go to the United Kingdom because it is here that BSE and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease has had its most important impact. And whereas foot and mouth disease is now eradicated from the UK, what we recognize with BSE is that we really have now a 50-year ongoing tragedy, really, of unknown dimension. Because this is a disease that has a very long incubation period. Well, what is BSE, or so-called mad cow disease? Well, it is a slowly progressive and ultimately fatal neurological disease affecting cattle. As I said, it's commonly known as mad cow disease, and it was first identified in 1986. What is the cause of BSE? Well, it is believed to have come about because animal feed in the United Kingdom, particularly that for calves and also for dairy cattle, often contains protein that is originating from meat and bone meal. In other words, there has been rendering of the product and then recycling. And the material in the cattle feed is actually, the infective material is a protein. And this is very different now from viruses. And it's a new concept that has really been advanced in the last 25 years of the last century, that proteins themselves could be infectious. And that is a very important concept to grasp. There are other diseases, apart from BSE, that can be grouped together as the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And in all these cases, they are associated with these, let's call them rogue proteins or prions. The first one, and it's a disease that's been known in Europe, particularly Scotland, since, in fact, the 1730s, so a long, long time ago, is that of scrapie. And as the name suggests, this is a disease that is associated with itching, pruritus in the sheep, and they tend to rub off their fleece. But in the 1960s, we recognized, in fact, a similar disease called transmissible mink encephalopathy in mink here in the United States. And that was probably associated with feeding down a cattle. Also within the United States, and very much coming to the fore now as a disease of some concern, is chronic wasting disease. Whether this is transmissible to people is a big question. At this stage, we suspect it is not. And then we see bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which emerged, as I said, in the 1980s, And we subsequently recognized that this particular prion also caused disease in cats, and it is now also associated with disease in human beings. But in humans, we have a whole slew of different diseases, many of which are exceedingly difficult to pronounce. The first one is Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which occurs in older people. And this is a spontaneous disease, not normally associated with a source of infection. And then we have Gertzmann-Straussler-Scheinker syndrome, fatal insomnia, and then Kuru. And these are diseases where animals are not necessarily associated with any transmission. However, variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the disease that we associate with bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So we now reduce this to a diagram. We can see that on this side of the line, and this line that goes through the center here is all important, we can see that we have chronic wasting disease, transmissible mink encephalopathy, scrapie, and BSE on this side of the equation. And then on the other side of the equation, we have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Kuru. And there is this question whether BSE causes the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. And the center of the diagram shows you, in fact, the protein associated with TSEs. And essentially what happens is that you get conformational change in the protein. There isn't even any mutation in the genes producing the product. Well, what are the characteristics of the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies? Well, all of them show an accumulation of infectious prion protein and vacuoles in the central nervous system when disease is present. Now, normal PRP is routinely synthesized and metabolized by a proteinase K enzyme in the brain. And the core, however, of the infectious product, which we abbreviate as PRP-SC, and the SC in this context is derived from scrapie, because this is the disease that has been studied mostly, is interestingly resistant to protease K treatment, and this therefore explains why it accumulates in the CNS and in some transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, in fact, in lymphoid tissue as well. Very complicated. But let's now bring it back to the realization that in the epidemic that occurred in Britain, and we associate this, as I said, with the recycling of prion material through animal feed, we recognize that by the period of the mid-90s, we were looking at somewhere in the region of 40,000, usually dairy cattle, being diagnosed with mad cow disease. Now, there was a ban put on the feeding very quickly of meat and bone meal to cattle, but because of the prolonged incubation period of these diseases, you can see that there was still a lag period before we in fact saw control of the disease. If we now look at the BSE infection cycle, we can see that if we assume that this animal here is infected, it goes to the slaughter plant perhaps before it's been clinically diagnosed, and meat products from that slaughter plant then get fed to humans. And we must remember that cooking of this product, of this prion material, does not denature it. So even if the hamburger is well done, it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have infected material. Likewise, then, if the animal goes to a rendering plant, then it will not go into, obviously, the human food marketing patterns, but goes into farm products, in other words, animal meat that is compounded into feed for the cattle, or alternatively, it in fact goes to cat food. And that's where we think feline spongiform encephalopathy in Britain originated. It's uncertain whether it ever went into sheep, which would of course confuse greatly the diagnosis of scrapie. But what we do know is that it went back to cattle, and this is the cycle that was then generated to make the epidemic the size that it ended up. Well, variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the human form of spongiform encephalopathy, or at least that is what a lot of people believe. Now, there's no definitive proof because we can't complete Koch's postulates when it comes to human diseases, but it is believed to be caused by eating beef infected with BSE. And interestingly, and we have no explanation for this either, it mainly occurs in young people. Now, this has got to be differentiated from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And it's unfortunate that the medical profession elected to use such similar terminology. Now, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease does occur here in the United States of America, and we get about 50 cases a year. The variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease does not. And the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is mainly seen in older people, people 50 years plus, which sort of brings me into that category, whereas variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease mainly occurs in younger people such as yourselves. Well, when was this relationship between BSE and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease discovered? In 1990, the Minister of Agriculture in Britain fed his daughter Cordelia a hamburger to prove, in fact, that beef was safe. And it was argued that scrapie, which occurred in Britain, had never caused human disease, so why should BSE? And there's a political lesson here. You never say never when you're dealing with biological systems. Because by 1996, it fell to the Prime Minister at that time, John Major, to announce that there seemed to be a relationship between 10 cases of this new disease called variant CJD, and its relationship to BSE was suspected at that time. Since then, we have seen, in fact, BSE occur in other areas of Europe, and most recently, as you will see here, it is in the year 2000, it was picked up, 2001 actually, it was picked up here in Japan, and as a result of that, beef consumption in Japan has fallen by 70%, and this has impacted, in fact, the exportation of beef products from here in the US. So this explains to you quite often how global trade is affected by the presence of these diseases. Even though we do not have BSE here in the United States, there is just a general concern about eating beef in Japan at this time. Now, you must also recognize that these diseases are often very much portrayed in the popular press, and sometimes they are in fact very well written. The articles are well written, but sadly sometimes the cover stories, which are obviously written by a different editor, they tend to, if I can use the word, hype the disease and can cause a certain disease it can cause certain disquiet in the general public as to, in fact, how important these diseases are. And you can see here in this slide that Newsweek talked about mad cow disease, and the implication being how it could possibly cause an epidemic here in the United States. These websites are very useful to give you further information on BSE and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So can we really relax here in the United States? Because we put up many means of preventing this disease coming into the United States. But we have to recognize that we do have scrapie here in the U.S. national sheep flock. We have in the past fed meat and bone meal to cattle, although mostly we use soybean as the protein supplement. We also have to recognize that we have chronic wasting disease in deer and elk, and at the moment this disease appears to be spreading. So very similar to this young lad down here, who is trying to see the future by lifting up the tapestry of the sky, we have to be aware that other diseases might emerge here in the US, and we have to be very aware of the impact they would have on the public at that time. So now what we can see is that BSE in large part involved both domestic animals and humans, and that in large part this was, the disease occurred because of the technology of recycling animal protein back to ruminants. And obviously ruminants are really not designed in the first place to be handling animal protein. After all, they are ruminants. Let's now move to the next disease, and this is a disease that some of you might have had experience with here in Florida, and that is West Nile virus. And I'll talk briefly as to how this virus moved from its beachhead, if I can use that phrase, in New York, and how it has spread subsequently to other parts of, particularly the eastern seaboard, but now is poised to spread even beyond the Rockies. And this is an arthropod-borne disease. An arbovirus is the characterization of West Nile virus. Now, West Nile virus, which, as you all know, affects not only people, but also affects wildlife and also affects horses, was first recognized in the area of New York itself, and subsequently in 1999, as you can see here, there were human cases scattered quite widely through that area. Also, we recognized early that birds were being infected, and that the basic life cycle involves mosquitoes and birds. And this is a summary of this life cycle. And we have to recognize that when the disease occurs in people, horses, and some mammals involving animals such as bats, the virus has reached a dead end. And for that reason, we call them dead-end hosts. In other words, the level of viremia is insufficient to perpetuate the virus. And the virus is really perpetuated in a cycle involving birds and mosquitoes, and in this cycle the crow, and we'll come back to this later, is also involved, has a very high level of viremia, but often dies, whereas most birds in fact do not show clinical disease. What's the history of West Nile? Well, West Nile is one of a family of very similar viruses which we call a serocomplex, and I won't go into the details here. But West Nile traditionally has been recognized in these areas that you see in blue, and as of 1999, of course, here is the beachhead in North America. And you can see that outbreaks have occurred through Europe and the Middle East, areas of Africa and Asia in the past. And once again, we can turn to molecular epidemiology and recognize that the strain of virus that appeared to come across into New York in 1999 was very similar, in fact, to an isolate that had been made from, in fact, it was geese in Israel in 1998, but there were also human cases in Israel at that time. If we look at what happened in 2001, you can see that in terms of, and this map here, the red shows areas where we have got disease in horses. You can see that the virus has spread quite widely along the eastern seacoast, but has also extended beyond the Mississippi now. And if we look at Florida, you can see that we had some 450 cases of West Nile in horses last year, and there was a high incidence of the disease actually in Alachua and Marion counties. Well, I've already mentioned that crows commonly die when infected with West Nile virus, and we've used this to indicate where the virus is present geographically. And they're ideal as indicators or sentinels because they're widely distributed throughout the United States. and we find them in many different habitats. And it's a relatively local species. It's a species that you and I can recognize, and therefore if we find a dead crow, we are now sensitized to report that to the public health authorities. And on that basis that the virus is present in high titer, quite often 10 to the 8 log units, the virus is relatively easy to isolate from dead crows, even if they've been dead a day or two. And as I said, they are a conspicuous bird, highly susceptible, and the virus titers are high enough to allow delayed testing. And if we now look at the surveillance methods available to us, we can obviously determine what's happening by just looking for human cases, or we can look for disease horses, or we can monitor mosquitoes. But best of all, we find that dead crows indicate to us the first activity in an area. So the dead crow as the sentinel for West Nile is a very important feature. Where is West Nile virus going to move in the future? Well, the truth of the matter is that it's predicted that this year it may well, in fact, be over here. Some would say that it might even get to the west coast. The truth of the matter is that the Culex species of mosquitoes that transmit this disease are widely distributed, and therefore there is really no bar to its expansion both in the US but also into the Caribbean. There have already been cases on the Grand Cayman Islands, human cases that is, and obviously it can move into Mexico, and it may well, in fact, in time, progress with the migratory bird patterns even to South America. At this point, I think it's appropriate that we now review where we've got to. We've already dealt with foot and mouth disease, and I pointed out to you that in your reading you should check up on swine vesicular disease and vesicular stomatitis. And more information on these diseases is in fact available in veterinary virology, and you may remember I showed you a slide of that particular textbook. It's published by Academic Press. I showed you a slide of veterinary virology in the virology lecture that I gave you as the first lecture in this series. But there are other virus diseases that, while they have not existed here or have never been confirmed here in the United States, are exceedingly important to us. The first one is African horse sickness. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, that we can use blue tongue in some ways as a parallel of what might happen were African horse sickness to come into this country. And the vector in this case, in fact, is Culicoides or Noceum, a very small insect vector. African swine fever we will deal with, tick transmitted, and then we'll work through to Rift Valley fever, a virus disease that I personally feel that we should take serious note of, because a bit like West Nile, it could come into the United States, and if it were to come into the United States, it could cause both human and domestic animal disease. By that I mean livestock disease. And finally, on a positive note, I'm going to talk a little bit about rinderpest and how we are now looking at the possibility that this disease will be eradicated from the globe. African horse sickness. Well, African horse sickness is caused by an orbivirus, which is very similar to blue tongue virus, and as I've already mentioned to you, it's transmitted by Culicoides, or midges, gnats as they are commonly called. And remember that as an arbovirus, African horse sickness virus replicates in the salivary glands of the insect, and it is transmitted then when the insect bites. Now, African horse sickness has a reservoir host, and the reservoir host, which is not clinically affected, is the zebra. And there have been outbreaks in Spain, particularly in the mid-80s, that were attributed to the movement of zebra from South Africa, in fact it was Namibia to be precise, that became infected shortly before they left Africa with African horse sickness virus, and they then were viremic when they arrived in Spain, and the culicoides present in Spain were then capable of transmitting this disease to domestic horses. As I said, it caused disease in Spain in the 80s, and earlier in the 60s it caused a major epidemic in the Middle East. There are vaccines available, most of them are live attenuated vaccines, but there are also some inactivated vaccines. Well, what are the clinical signs of African horse sickness? How would you recognize it if we were to get it, say, here in Florida? This is a virus disease that is characterized by edema. It's very prominent, and you can see edema affecting the supraorbital fossa in the horse, and this is fairly pathognomonic. But the virus is doing most of its damage actually in the lungs. It's a hemorrhagic disease in that respect. And this leads quite often to an extensive lung exudate, and it is this that leads in some ways to asphyxiation. The animal literally suffocates in the foam that it produces from the lungs. And if we were to look at, for example, the lungs at post-mortem, we would see that there is often extensive interlobular edema. And animals that are affected with African horse sickness are going to have very high levels of virus present in the blood. But in addition to that, they'll also be running a high fever. And the preceding slide, which was of a Shire horse, was one of some 11 Shire horses that I was associated with in West Africa that had been brought out from Britain, and they were uniquely susceptible to this disease, and all of them died within a short period of time. I think that tells us the impact that this disease might have were it to come into Florida. In other words, we would have extensive mortality with this particular virus, particularly here in northern Florida, where we have the thoroughbred industry. And it is significant that the culicoides that are present here in Florida transmitting blue tongue between cattle and to sheep, these culicoides are also capable of transmitting African horse sickness virus. We know that from experimental work done in Europe. So now let's move on to African swine fever. This is another arbovirus disease, and one that is particularly interesting in so many different ways. It's interesting to us because it's actually caused by a DNA arbovirus. Now remember, arboviruses traditionally are RNA viruses. They're not DNA viruses, but this one is unique. And it is possible that the disease in swine, which can be associated with 90% mortality, is actually an aberration of a virus that is very well adapted to, in fact, life with soft ticks. Now, I mentioned to you that it's transmitted by soft ticks, but this virus moves principally between countries in the vehicle of infected meat. In other words, infected meat is brought into a country, and this is the way in which this virus has traditionally spread into countries such as Malta, the photograph that you're seeing here, and it can be transmitted once it's in domestic pigs by direct contact between pigs. So while the disease is initially in its reservoir situation being transmitted by ticks with warthogs, what happens is that when it gets into domestic animals, it's capable of pig-to-pig transmission. It's a hemorrhagic disease with high mortality, and what we must remember is that it has been introduced into the Caribbean, into Cuba in the 60s, and then subsequently in the late 70s and early 80s it was present in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it's probably the most important disease of swine worldwide. It's characterized by high fever and hemorrhage, and one of the signs, it's not pathognomonic, but it is highly suggestive of African swine fever, is the fact that you get a very enlarged spleen, as you will see here at postmortem. And you can see here hemorrhage within the kidney, and what you see here is the diagnostic approach, which is recognizing the virus, usually in macrophages, and using fluorescent technology. Well, when the disease was introduced to the Caribbean, the United States Department of Agriculture was so concerned about this that in fact it declared an animal disease emergency, and as a result of this, and this is Port-au-Prince down here, in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, there was an eradication program, and all the swine on the island of Hispaniola, that's, as you know, the two countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, all the animals were slaughtered to control this disease. There is no vaccine for African swine fever. And you can see in this lower slide here that the impact on the USDA agriculture, of the US's agriculture, and this is now in 1980 dollars, was considerable. It was projected that were the disease to come into the country. Now let's move on to Rift Valley fever, and to point out to you how very important this disease is, and the fact that in the year 2000, it, for the first time, was recognized outside of Africa. Obviously, as the name suggests, this virus, this disease, was first recognized in the Rift Valley, and as you know, that is this area extending down through here. And these countries outlined in red have had a fairly long history of recognizing Rift Valley. But we can also say that there are other countries throughout Africa where the virus is certainly present, but we have not seen major epidemics of disease. Well, what is Rift Valley fever and what is its epidemiology? Well, it is primarily, once again, an arthropod-borne disease of ungulates, and it causes usually abortion in adults, but it causes deaths in both calves and more particularly young lambs. Now man, and by that I mean obviously the gender, the species rather than the gender, is usually infected by secondary vector species. So the primary cycle involving mosquitoes involves domestic animals, and man becomes infected by other mosquitoes, not the primary species that is transmitting the disease amongst the livestock, but a secondary species transmits it to humans. And that explains why when we look at epidemics, we see that in humans we in fact get a lower prevalence of disease than we see in livestock. Now the disease in humans is characterized quite often by high fever, influenza-like syndrome, you could say, feeling really rough, but in some cases you get encephalitis and death, and we've seen that particularly in outbreaks in Egypt in the past, where many people developed encephalitis and died because of that. Now, while most of the community is likely to be infected by mosquitoes, when it comes to butchers and veterinarians, we find that anyone associated with doing post-mortems on animals can become infected through an aerosol transmission of this virus, and that's why this is rather important to remember. And as I said to you, in the year 2000, for the first time, the virus escaped, if one can use that phrase, from Africa and caused disease in Saudi Arabia, principally in this area of Saudi Arabia as opposed to the whole country. And this was believed to be associated, in fact, with the movement of the virus, probably in infected animals, into this area of the world. And as you can see that in the epidemic in Saudi Arabia, there were nearly 1,000 people hospitalized, and there were some 123 deaths associated with the virus. We don't know how the virus actually got to Saudi Arabia, but what we do know is that there were indicators that Rift Valley fever was going to occur, in fact, in the area of East Africa using satellite technology. Now, and I introduced this slide because this gives you some idea of some of the sophisticated technology now available to provide prediction of when an epidemic might occur. And what happened in East Africa, in Kenya, was that they had very heavy rains, and this allowed the mosquito species that transmit this virus to proliferate, and since they become infected quite often and transmit the virus vertically, what happened was that you had this sudden mushrooming of infected mosquitoes, and an epidemic of the disease occurred in 1997, 1998 in East Africa, and subsequently this somehow or other probably spread to Saudi Arabia. So, in summary, Rift Valley fever is certainly a virus that we should be very aware of, and it is possible that this virus could be introduced, perhaps in the form of a viremic traveler, into the United States. And finally, let's now look at rinderpest, and as I said, we can finish on a somewhat upbeat note when it comes to this disease. Now, this is smallpox, and we've been made aware of the importance of smallpox recently because of its possible use as an agent for bioterrorism. And while we've been talking about foreign animal diseases today, we should also remember that while these diseases, the animal diseases, may be spreading naturally, we also have to consider that many of them, particularly foot and mouth disease, could in fact be used as a weapon by bioterrorists. Now, we have no indication that what happened in Britain was caused by bioterrorism, but I think what we can see is that because of the extent, in fact, of the epidemic in the United Kingdom, that clearly this is going to be a very attractive agent for bioterrorists around the world. Now, to come back to smallpox, what we see is that smallpox is, in fact, the very first virus disease of mammals to have been eradicated. And it was eradicated by an extensive vaccination program by the World Health Organization, and by 1980, the World Health Organization could, in fact, congratulate itself and all the member countries that this terrible disease had been eradicated. But at that time, it was hoped that rinderpest might even have been eradicated before smallpox, but that was not to be because an epidemic occurred in West Africa because of poor vaccination coverage and subsequently spread widely. But we have now got to the point where, in fact, we can look towards the eradication of rinderpest by the year 2010, and I'll mention that a little later. Rinderpest causes, in contrast with foot and mouth disease, which does not cause extensive death, but foot and mouth disease, as you all know, causes a protracted convalescence, rinderpest kills, and about 80 to 90% of cattle can die during an epidemic. Here on the right you see dead cattle in Iran in the late 60s during an epidemic of rinderpest. And on the left here you can see the erosive nature of rinderpest. Remember, this disease in the individual animal is very difficult to differentiate from bovine virus diarrhea. But it isn't vesicular as foot and mouth disease is. You can see that you've got erosions here also on the lips above the dental pad. The history of rinderpest is that it has devastated not only domestic livestock, but it also devastated, in fact, wildlife when it got into Africa. And it was introduced to Africa. This diagram here just shows you what happened when it was introduced to Ethiopia at the turn of the 20th century, in other words, the late 1890s. It spread very widely, so that some years later it was present down here in South Africa, and it was down here that this photograph was taken, and you can see dead cattle just lying around the place. So high mortality is a characteristic of this disease. It's caused by a virus that is closely related to measles, canine distemper, and peste petit ruminant. And these are the morbilliviruses. And there is also a whole slew of different morbilliviruses also affecting whales, porpoises, dolphins, etc. in the marine milieu. Very fortunately, we have got an excellent modified live vaccine against rinderpest, and this has been the tool that has been used extensively against rinderpest. And of course, from your knowledge of canine distemper, you know that's a similar vaccine that's also been very effective. And the situation is that it is now present only in East Africa and Pakistan, and that's why we have this prospect of global eradication. And I want to remind you once again, since we have bovine virus diarrhea here in the United States, that we always need to be cognizant that it needs to be differentiated from rinderpest. However, if you have a rinderpest epidemic, you would be seeing many animals dying, whereas with BVD, that is not normally the situation. Let's have a look now at the rinderpest eradication progress since the early 1980s. You can see here that in the early 1980s, the disease was present throughout sub-Saharan West Africa, extending then through to Egypt, Sudan, and the countries of East Africa, but also was present throughout the Middle East, extending through to India. Then by the early 1990s, vaccination programs in West Africa and East Africa led to an improved situation, and there were similar programs also going on within Asia at that time, but the disease certainly had not been eradicated. But by the year 2000, what we now see is that we suspect that disease in the Sudan, even though it's shown here in 2000 as possibly present, we've not been able to confirm that recently, but it is present in wildlife at this stage in Kenya, and the other center is here in the Indus Valley in Pakistan. And obviously Afghanistan is here, and with the opening of Afghanistan to increased trade, it is feared that rinderpest could possibly move into that area. So there is very much a keen approach at the moment to eradicating the virus here in Pakistan. And as we will see with all foreign animal diseases, our ability to control them is really dependent upon the world community working together. Rinderpest, which is also known as cattle plague, is, we hope, going to be eradicated by the year 2010. We don't have prospects of eradicating diseases worldwide, such as foot and mouth disease, because of the complex epidemiology of this disease. But we do have early reporting systems through the Office International des Épizooties in Paris, and obviously national veterinary services are very alert to the introduction of agents into their respective countries, and there are systems for rapid diagnosis. In the case of the United States, Plum Island provides that diagnosis. But you can see here the many different agencies, whether it's FAO, OIE, European Union, USAID, etc., that get involved in monitoring and controlling these diseases. So at that point, that's the end of this lecture. When I see you down in Nova in about 2 weeks' time, I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.